Hey, everybody. Thanks for joining in our weekly lecture series here on Money Meets Medicine. I'm Jimmy Turner. Super excited today to talk to you about a couple of the personal finance rules that really helped my family succeed early on when we were in training, and that we still apply, although they've been adapted a little bit. We'll talk about that today. Appreciate everyone joining in and chatting in the chat box. It's there for you. So if you have questions as we go, if you want to say hi to other people, let us know where you're from. That sort of thing, then please use the chat box to kind of engage with this. I'll be asking you some questions and talking along the way as we go. Before we dive into the Diderot effect and the two different rules that apply to medical professionals and physicians in particular, I want to remind you that Money Meets Medicine exists, where you can go and download your free copy of the Physician Philosopher's Guide to Personal Finance, completely free book that I wrote, poured my heart and soul into, and it's really the 20% of personal finance you need to know to get 80% of the results. Should you want to continue your financial education, you can also do that on moneymeetsmedicine.com and join Medical Degree Financial University, where we've laid out everything you need to do in a step-by-step process, including worksheets and how to apply that to your life. And so with that said, we're going to dive into this talk on the two rules and how they can make an impact in your life. All right. So as we get started here, this is, of course, Dennis Diderot. This talk's named after him, right? So this is one of my favorite examples in all of personal finance. Dennis Diderot is the French philosopher who, in the 1700s, basically didn't make a lot of money. He wrote encyclopedias. He was an author, and during that time, was getting by but not doing well financially. There's a Russian empress who comes by, loves his work, and so she decides that she wants to buy all of his books. And when she buys all of his books, Diderot comes into a lot of money all of a sudden, right? And including all of that money, she buys him a nice scarlet robe, and so Diderot writes this hilarious, philosophical writing, because he is a philosopher, and where he basically talks about, being the master of his old gown. But when he got this new gown, he felt like he needed a new mantle over the fireplace, a new, coffee table and Persian rug on the floor. And so Diderot warned people of the contamination of sudden wealth. In other words, of coming into money very quickly, and that the poor man may take with ease his appearances, but the rich man is always under a strain, meaning that once you have, you want more. And so Diderot is an interesting person, right? And as we dive into this talk, I'm huge on disclosures. So general education only. I'm not an attorney, financial advisor, chartered financial analyst, the whole nine yards. That said, Dennis Diderot, this guy, his story applies to us, right? As physicians, but also as just, people that are, living our life. So if you can, in the chat box, toss in a couple of things. What are some examples in your life or that you've heard of when people all of a sudden come into money? What is an example of that? There's always a bit of a delay here with the chat box. So I'll write down one while you're typing it up. So one is, right, when you go from being in training to when you are an attending, right? Yeah. So becoming a resident, that's actually another good one. So when you go from MS4 to becoming a resident, all of a sudden you went from making $0 to making, $60,000. When you go from making $60,000 to making $200,000, $300,000, $400,000, $500,000, that's also another big jump, right? And so some other examples that exist, while you're thinking about it, right, is, you might come into an inheritance, right? You might get a raise or a bonus. Yeah, and so and Shannon's talking about the Diderot effect in medicine, right? So buying so much house after training that you can't save, invest for your future. That's exactly right. And so there are lots of different examples of this, right? You might win the lottery, although that's less common. But those examples of when you come into a sudden wealth, sudden contamination of wealth, when you, in particular, become an attending physician, is extremely important, because there's this psychological phenomenon called the Diderot effect, right? Because Diderot ended up going broke, right? So he came into this sudden accumulation of wealth, and despite that, ended up finding financial catastrophe. And the reason why was because he wasn't aware of the psychological phenomenon that he would become notorious for. The Diderot effect is obviously not something you want to be known for, but that's what he is known for. This is the same phenomenon that happens to actresses and entertainers and to, professional athletes, I guess nowadays college athletes that are landing these giant NIL deals. And in that moment, if you're unaware of this effect, you will make massive mistakes. But if we know that it exists, we can do something about it, right? So last week in our lecture in Personal Finance 101, we talked about my pay during residency. The average PGY1 pay right now, $3,500 per month. That's post-tax. And then an example of an attending paycheck that I've had, shared that last week. So if you missed Personal Finance 101, make sure to go back, check that out. It's in the live video section underneath the YouTube channel. You click on live, you'll see all the live lectures that are there. So we're going through a Personal Finance 101 lecture series at the moment. This was my post-tax take-home pay, right? So if you look at that compared to my resident $3,500 take-home pay, it's a $10,000 difference. I think by every measure, that's what Diderot would have called a sudden accumulation of wealth, right? And so, yeah, and Sierra's talking about a generational inheritance, right? That inheritance from someone else, as an example of when that might happen as well. When you have this big of a jump in pay, it's really important to take care of your financial tasks first and then to spend money, as opposed to doing what most people do, which is to spend money and then say, hey, how much do I have left to save? But how do we do this? How do we go about saving first, taking care of our financial tasks, and making sure that we do things in the right order? That's where these two rules come in. So we can combat the Diderot effect with something called the 10% rule. And as I mentioned, let's take the difference in my attending paycheck post-tax and my post-tax paycheck as a resident, $10,000. And let's see how the 10% rule would apply in this situation. So the 10% rule here for me and my family, we basically ended up paying off $300,000 of debt, and paid off 200 grand of student loans in particular in about 19 months, increased our net worth by $500,000, put us on, the path to be financially independent, our mid 40s. So this is a really, really important rule. It really works and it gets the job done. And the reason that this works is because it allows you to enjoy some of that hard-earned money that you've suddenly come into, while at the same time allowing us to take care of financial tasks that need to happen. Okay. So I've seen this rule be wildly successful. It's one of the rules that I hear about all the time from podcast listeners and the audience, at moneymeetsmedicine.com about, making the biggest impact in their life. And so if we take that $10,000 difference, this is what that 10% rule would look like. We would take $1,000 and we would spend it on whatever our heart desires, right? So I'm not going to put you, in a box here. And, for example, when we did this, I'm a big car guy. I'm still a car guy to this day. And when I finished training, fellowship for me, I went and bought a V8, manual transmission, naturally aspirated car, 4-door sedan that my kids, loved riding in, 400 horsepower. And you know what? I actually financed that car. And if you talk to any financial guru, they are going to tell you that is a terrible financial decision. But I think personal finance is personal. I don't like putting people in boxes. I like teaching rules and principles and financial literacy. But I took $1,000 a month because that was my increase, so $12,000 a year, and I was going to spend it on whatever my heart desired. No rules attached, right? We also bought a membership to a country club at the time, the least expensive one in the area, but it was a country club and a car, right? And we did a few other things that my wife wanted to do with that money each month. Our family spent $1,000 on things that the vast majority of the personal finance community would tell you is a terrible idea. But we took the other 90%, right? And we paid off that $19,000 or that, $200,000 in 19 months. We built our wealth. We invested that money. And so as we did that, we were able to enjoy the 10% while doing 90% with the responsible increase in pay that we had. Okay. And so this was, a big deal. And if you think about it from the residency paycheck, you're basically increasing your lifestyle by 1.3, 1.4, 150%. It's not quite a doubling of your salary, but it's significant. And this isn't something you have to do forever. We'll talk about that here in a minute. But for us, we did do this for the first 24 months until my student loans were gone. And then this 10% rule expanded a little bit. We'll talk about that in a moment. But your first 2 to 3 to 4 years after you finish training are fundamentally important. And I would argue that anytime you come into a sudden contamination of wealth, you need to be aware of the Diderot effect and the impact that it will have on you psychologically. So in residency, right? So someone gave an example earlier when you go from being a fourth year medical student to residency, you're also coming into an increase in pay, right? So you might take, $350, 10%, and spend it on things you love. And you might take the other 90%, and build wealth. Now, that said, in residency, that $3,500 paycheck, right? So if you're listening to this, I want to mention this. A lot of time in residency, you're just trying to get by. I'm going to be honest. I saved $0 during my residency, during my fellowship, and I didn't become financially literate until my fellowship. But that said, looking back, we're still going to be able to be financially independent in our mid 40s, despite not saving anything. And so if you're in residency, you're about to get into residency, wherever you may be in your journey, sometimes financially, all we can do is get by. And so this 10% rule, I think, is a little more applicable, right, to when you become an attending physician, or you come into that inheritance, you get that bonus, that raise, whatever it might be. I do want to make a comment about this, though. Just get by. It's okay. There's nothing wrong with that in residency. That said, if you have the ability, you have the means, obviously you want to take care of financial tasks, own occupation disability insurance, coming up with the student loan plan. If you can invest money, great. You might consider, a Roth IRA, or to save pre-tax to lower your student loans. We're going to talk about all of that in future lectures. That said, this is predominantly for that attending physician jump. So if you're going to take this 10% rule and put it into practice, I'm just kind of curious, right? What would you use your 10% on? So we talked last week about our why, but as you're typing in the chat box, let us know, like, what would you use your 10% on? Is this something that, would be a car for you? Like, are you going to buy a V8 car like I did, or a country club membership? Like, what would you use your 10% on if there were no rules attached? If you could spend that 10% on anything, toss in the chat box. Let's see if we've got some common themes here. Maybe people have similar interests. Maybe you're a car person or a golf person like me. Although, to be clear, playing golf and being good at golf are two very different things. I play golf. I'm not good at golf. All right. So we got travel, spa days, right? Love it. Building hobbies. A new car. See, there's someone else is a car person here. That's good. All right. And then, so you might have some, health and wellness days, taking care of yourself. Right. So you might get that country club membership, the VA car. You might travel, spend it on clothes, you name it. It's really, at the end of the day, up to you, right? That other 90%, right, naturally is going to go towards credit card debt, student loans, creating an emergency fund. In a future lecture here soon, we're actually going to be talking about this exact, process, the order in which to pay down debt and to invest. So if you are looking for that, that'll be coming up in a lecture very soon. But we want to basically increase our wealth, right? So when we think about that, right, we're trying to increase our assets, decrease our debts, and the two of those things combined will increase our net worth, right? And so increasing our net worth is ultimately the main goal. And this 10% rule allows us to know that we're going to be human, and that when we come into a large, sudden accumulation of wealth, we are going to want to spend it all. You have to realize that there's a reason why actresses and entertainers and athletes and physicians, right? And this applies to APPs as well, right? So, you go straight from school to becoming a CRNA or PA, like that is a sudden jump in wealth, right? So the 10% rule is, you can consider that something that happens when you have a bolus of cash, right? So I'm an anesthesiologist. So I think about infusions, that sort of thing, right? Like, this is something that you take into effect, you consider when you have a sudden accumulation, a bolus of finances, right? The 30% rule we're going to talk about in a second is more like, your maintenance, right? Like, this is the ongoing rule that kind of helps dictate some of the direction you might take your finances, and help you figure out some general rules of thumb in terms of saving. So the 30% rule, sometimes known as the 50-20-30 rule, is an adaptation of Elizabeth Warren's 50-30-20 rule. And, in that one, it's basically 50% wants, 20%, 50% needs, 30% wants, save 20% of your income. I don't think this gets the job done. And the reason why is because of that 20%. Okay. So when you finish training, you've got to realize that saving 20% of your income for a decent number of people is likely not going to get you to be able to retire at the age that you want. And it's certainly not going to be able to get you to be financially independent and to practice medicine because you want to, and not because you have to, by the age that you want. Okay. So I'm not a big fan on 20% for that reason. And part of the reason why, right? So if we go back to this, is that this 30%, we're going to talk about using that 30% to build wealth, right? So this is our wealth accumulation rate. So WAR, if you want to think about it right like that. So this 30% rule is to pay down debts and increase assets. And so if you tell somebody, hey, like you need to be saving 20%, well, like what about the person that, has a, $4,000 per month student loan payment, right? Like where does that count in the process? I think it's much better to focus on building wealth than it is to focus on, just complete asset generation. I don't think that that's necessarily a healthy exercise for people that have $400,000 in student loans. So that said, 50, 20, 30 rule. So fixed expenses, right? So what are some examples of fixed expenses? Well, you might have a mortgage payment, right? You might have a car loan. You might have technically a credit card payment that you have each month. These are fixed expenses, right? These are things that you're in your current situation required to pay. Now that doesn't mean that they're fixed in the sense that you couldn't downsize from your current house or that you couldn't get rid of your car and walk to work, but they are currently fixed expenses in your lifestyle. Okay. So fixed expenses are different than, variable expenses, because as you look through these examples, childcare, utilities, cell phones, your own occupation, disability insurance payment or life insurance payment. You might have that country club membership from that 10% rule increase, right? These are different from variable expenses, because variable expenses are things that are going to obviously vary from month to month. So you might be going out to, dinner with friends. You might be going on a date night. You might be going to a concert or a movie or, what have you. These are going to be things that are going to vary. But ultimately, it really comes down to the 30% rule, right? So if we think about these things, at the end of the day, when you break up anything, the focus is really on this 30%, right? Like how much are you using to build wealth, particularly in those early years, but then ongoing, right? So I consider this a 30% war, wealth accumulation rate, which includes basically the purpose of increasing your net worth. So that means paying down debt, investing predominantly, if you want to break it down into those two different things, right? So your wealth accumulation rate is simply your annual wealth building, right? Divided by your annual gross income, and naturally you're going to multiply that by 100 to get a percentage. But this is something that is going to be ongoing, a number that you're looking at in order to increase your wealth. So increased assets, decreased debts. As an example of that, paying off mandatory debt like student loans, or increasing assets. You might be buying real estate, which I'm not getting on my soapbox right now, but I don't think that your asset allocation should be 100% real estate. I think that is a massive disservice and just like a complete ignorance of diversification. Talked about that in the podcast episode recorded on Friday. That'll be coming out in the future. So you can check that out. But you need to be diversified. Okay. And as you do this, you got to keep in mind that when you're paying off non-mandatory debt, that's a fixed expense, right? So in other words, like this isn't encouraging you to go buy a $200,000 car and to call that a fixed expense, right? That and saying I'm paying off my debt because I have a $200,000 car note that I'm paying down. That is not an example, right? So mandatory debt is very different. You have to live somewhere, right? So you're going to be paying rent or mortgage. That's going to be a fixed expense, right? You've got to live somewhere. You have to have transportation depending on where you live. But the kind of transportation you have, you got to think about that. We're talking about mandatory stuff. So if you look at this, the 50, 20, 30 rule, or more importantly, this 30%, if I had a $300,000 base salary, this means that I would be taking $90,000 a year and accumulating wealth with this. Now, if you look at those numbers, it's important to know that ultimately this is a tool. It is a guide. I'm in the way here. It is a rule of thumb, right? But the most common question that I get, I'm sure, sure I'll get it in the chat box or an email later. When it comes to this is this pre-tax or is it post-tax? I think that the important part of this is your 30%, right? At the end of the day, the other part's your expenses. You can do whatever you want with the money that you take home, so long as you're taking 30% of your gross income and you're paying off your debt and you're increasing your assets. All right. And if you do that, I promise you that you will be financially independent before 60, 65. It'll probably be in your 50s. For some of you, that'll be in your 40s. So if you take 30% of your gross income to build wealth, particularly in the first 3 to 5 years, you will have a lot of success. Okay. So this is, if the 10% rule is the bolus, right? What do you do with a massive bolus or increase in wealth? The 30% rule is kind of your ongoing, how much of my gross income should I be using to build wealth, right? My wealth accumulation rate. 30% for the vast majority of us is going to get us to a very, very reasonable place. Now, again, ultimately, this is a rule, a guide, a rule of thumb, if you will. But you can view this, you know, on the expense side, that the 50-20, I don't really care. The rest of the money you take home after you take care of your finances. So when you save first, right, this is the 30%. When you spend the rest, who cares how you do it, as long as you make sure that you're not going into credit card debt, you're not decreasing your wealth, because you're building your wealth with 30% of your income, right? Save the 30% off the top automatically, and the rest is expenses. They can be fixed or variable. This could be the 35 35 30 rule. It doesn't really matter, but that 30% is fundamentally important, particularly in those early years of training. So things do change. And, if you have questions about this or about other topics, feel free to toss them in the chat box as we kind of wind this down. Trying to keep each lecture each week to 20 to 30 minutes, because, we're all busy medical professionals. I want you to get back to your family, friends, your Sunday, whatever you're doing on this day. But things change, right? So my family actually, spent 30% gross and really built wealth with that. But then after we got rid of my student loans and after we got rid of the auto debt, and all we had left was a mortgage, right? And so all of a sudden, that $90,000 was basically going straight towards investments. And I started realizing as I got further out that actually I had enough money where now, if I literally stopped investing today, because I did put 30% away for those first 3 to 5 years, I don't have to invest any more money. My family would be financially independent by the age of 60, 65 without investing another dime. The reason that happened is because of this 30% rule. But the thing that I'm saying there and that I'm pointing out is that this 30% rule doesn't always have to be 30%, right? Let's say you come out and you don't have any student loans. You don't have any, auto loan debt. You just have a mortgage. Maybe you don't even have a mortgage. Well, in that situation, 20% might get you there. That's still going to be completely dependent upon how much money you spend each month and how much money you want to spend in retirement. I still think 30% in those first 3 to 5 years is a really good idea. But for my family, what this 30% did is created something called Coast Fire. And as you're listening to this live, you can go find an episode that we actually just released on Wednesday. Justin Harvey, financial planner, friend, and co-host of Money Meets Medicine. And I talk about this concept of Coast Fire, where now, because we save 30% those first 3 to 5 years, I only work 0.75 FTE, which strangely in a shift work specialty means 2 days a week for like 42 weeks of the year. The other, 10 weeks, I'm either off or working full time those 5 days. But that was afforded to my family because we saved 30% early. Okay. So there's a big benefit to this. If you can put the work in early on, right, and save a decent amount of money, then you can either cut down and maybe this becomes the 10%, right? You're only saving 10% of your income because you've done the math and you realize I don't have to save as much to retire or to become financially independent by the age that I want. And you can coast. I love this concept. Go listen to the podcast episode. Actually, it's on the YouTube channel as well because we publish the podcast episodes on there. So just go to the YouTube channel since you're listening here on YouTube and look up the episode on Coast Fire. It's a really cool concept, but the only reason that was possible is because of the 30% rule. Now, the 10% rule, remember, I got to the point where, my family and I, we were only down to our mortgage. And so this 10% rule, I'm gonna be honest with you, when we take home bonuses or, incentive pay or for whatever reason we come into money, it's no longer the 10% rule. This thing's now the 50% rule, right? I mean, we take 50% of it and we might, put a little more money towards our kids' college education, but we take the other 50% and we go travel. We do things as a family. And so those first 3 to 5 years, massively important to make sure that you are taking care of things and that you are putting your ducks in a row, but just recognize it's not always going to be that way. You're putting in the early work so that you can enjoy the rest. Okay. Before you leave, make sure to check out moneymeetsmedicine.com. Get your free copy of the book. It's a really good foundational, way to start and to kind of build that foundation. Continue your education here on the YouTube channel or on the podcast. And remember, take home 30% rules for maintenance, ongoing. That 10% rule is for any time that you receive a bolus of cash. And if you apply these 2 rules to your situation, I promise you, you'll find lots of financial success. And even if you are further out than the 3 to 5 years, or you're not in residency as you listen to this, you can still take these rules and apply them, right? As your situation is different, all of our situations are different, to find that financial success that you're looking for. So, this is the end of the Diderot Effect and those 2 rules. We will continue our weekly lecture series next Sunday, 2 p.m. Check out the YouTube channel. Make sure to visit moneymeetsmedicine.com. Snag your free copy of the book. Get your disability insurance if you need it, or to continue your financial journey through Medical Degree Financial University. I will see you next week. Cheers.